First thing we're going to look at is the use of AI in legal services, and this follows on slightly from some of the comments that Tim's already made. We will then take a look at autonomous vehicles and finally turning to smart contracts. So turning first to the use of AI in legal services. At present, the legal services industry in the UK is worth about £30 billion, and that equates to about 2% of GDP, so it's quite a large market. In the last couple of years, we've seen substantial investment in AI in legal services here in the UK. There's been a number of law firms that have teamed up with various different providers like Kira, like IBM Ross, to develop either AI systems for in-house use or to use it for app development, contract reviews, etc. And recently, in May of this year, the first case involving the use of predictive coding went before the High Court. So obviously that was a groundbreaking decision there that the court allowed that evidence in. So as Tim's already mentioned, software for the legal industry generally needs to be both intelligent and smart. Because the tool is being used to support, as you say on the slide, repetitive, process-intensive and standardizable components of legal work. This is generally the starting point for AI in legal services. So what are we talking about? We're talking about document reviews from a due diligence perspective. We're talking about e-discovery or e-disclosure in court cases and dispute resolutions. And finally, then, we're also looking at contract review, drafting, and analysis. And as you move down through these topics, sort of the requirements that you will seek from your AI increase with the level of technicality of the type of service being offered or being supported by your AI model. To get that type of AI working well, there's four main characteristics that, generally speaking, we would look to put in place. Tim has already touched on some of these in his talk, but it's probably worth just having a look at them in a little bit more detail. We've obviously heard a lot already about using natural language interfaces, and this again is very important, and sort of, as Tim had said, the move from keyword searches to be able to speak in your sort of usual day-to-day English to your AI model is quite helpful. We also want the AI to be context aware. So in other words, it will need to know what it's being asked to look at. Is it a contract for services? Does it relate to property? Is it something completely different? So the AI will need to know what type of legal work it's being asked to do. So we'll need to train the system to do that. We'd also expect the system to generate evidence-based responses. So that the computer says yes, computer says no, without any more information isn't going to be particularly helpful here. Because we want the AI to be able to tell us why it has flagged this document or why it has suggested this approach. And finally then, sort of tying the three of those together is that ultimately we want the AI to be cognitive and dynamic. We want it to learn from feedback from us, and we want it to learn from its mistakes, so that it continues to improve the service offering that's made available to you. So bearing those factors in mind, it's worth then taking a look at how AI will be considered from a regulatory perspective for your law firm. So generally speaking, there's probably 5 different areas of regulation or terms and conditions that we need to think about here. The first is that obviously as a law firm who's using AI, you will need to ensure that you comply with your regulatory obligations vis-a-vis the solicitor's regulatory authority or some other regulations if you're working in specific areas. You may then, in addition, be subject to indirectly an additional layer of regulation because of the industry that your client is in. So if firms are regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority, they may seek to flow down some of their regulatory obligations to you to make sure that they're compliant. There's then the Solicitor's Regulation Authority's Code of Conduct. So this regulates how solicitors conduct their businesses. There is a number of general obligations, but specifically in relation to AI that is provided on a sort of contract basis by a third party. The SRA imposes certain conditions in relation to that outsourcing. So again, it's worth bearing in mind that you might need to check that you're meeting all of those requirements. In terms of the SRA Code of Conduct and its application to outsourcing, there's nothing particularly groundbreaking or technical here. They're just reflect good practice guidelines that a lot of sort of clients would have in place. We'd also need to look at the terms of engagement between the solicitor and client, or the firm and client, to make sure that if you are using AI, you're explaining that to your clients and you're explaining to them what you're using the AI for, and if you're sort of taking a different approach to potential liability in that regard. And finally, as well, obviously from a professional indemnity insurance perspective, the insurers will need to know if you're using AI and whether that's sort of in-house or outsourced AI. And we would expect as this gets used more frequently that obviously the insurers would then take that into account when calculating your policies and premiums. So moving on from AI, we are moving now from the static example of AI in legal services to the dynamic example of autonomous vehicles. Autonomous vehicles combine 3 different aspects of AI: machine learning, machine perception, and machine control. The intention, as Tim has already said, is that the vehicle will, with the use of AI, be capable of making decisions about all of its activities when driving with little or no human intervention. To do so successfully, we need to move from the traditional driving perspective, which the government has summarised as sort of hands-on and eyes-on. So you as the driver are operating the car, you're paying attention to what's going on around you, and you're reacting as a result of that. There's then a middle stage where we have hands temporarily off, and that's where the car takes control. So sort of an early example of that would be the cruise control systems, where you set that you want to drive at the speed limit and the car takes control of that. Ultimately to a completely autonomous vehicle where you as the driver or the passenger have no control over the car and you're not responsible for taking in any of your surrounding environment, and that's all done by the vehicle. To get to that end point, this slide is adopted from OECD International Transport paper on autonomous driving. And it just gives you a flavour of all of the different types of sensors and factors that your AI, who's driving your autonomous vehicle, will need to be able to sense, recognise, process, and react to. When I saw this first, I was quite astounded by the level of detail on it. I think because for us, when we drive a car, once we've learned how to do it, all of this happens autonomously, and we don't really think that much about it on a sort of an actual conscious level. So this just gives you a flavour of all of the different things that we need to put in place, as I've said. Now, some of these you will recognise already. For example, parking sensors. If you've, as I mentioned, cruise control, there may be on your sat-nav information about speed limits or pedestrian lights or other traffic updates that you get. But ultimately, to move to that hands-off, eyes-off environment, it's this type of information that the car and the AI that's driving it will need to process. Surprisingly, actually, at least from my perspective, was that when we looked into this, we realised that it's actually permissible at the moment to test autonomous vehicles in the UK without a licence or without any prior notification. So over the last couple of years, the Department of Transport has set up what it's called the Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles. And its task is sort of to look into this area, see what's happening, sort of try and predict where this will go, but also to assess whether and to what extent regulatory change is required. So the initial review was conducted in February 2015, and that led to the publication of a code of practice for testing in July last year. Now that code of practice for testing is sort of really helpful, but also not particularly groundbreaking in that the code says that, if you're testing an autonomous vehicle, it has to comply with all existing laws. It must be roadworthy. There must be a suitable driver or operator present, and that individual must be able to take control in the event that he or she thinks something is going to go wrong. So it's basically sort of the standard rules of the road for all of us as drivers. They have later then conducted a consultation just to gain sort of feedback and information on how people think the regulatory environment needs to change and what needs to be done to sort of reduce some of the risks surrounding autonomous vehicles. And in order to do that, there's, as you see on the last bullet point on the slide, there's 2 or 3 things so far that have been identified as things that will need to change to allow autonomous vehicles on the road, assuming they comply with the code of practice and there aren't significant increases in sort of accidents or deaths. So the first thing the Department of Transport has said is we need to amend insurance legislation to allow for autonomous vehicles. We also need to clarify the provisions that apply in relation to the build and use of new or near-to-market technologies. So this is around the Department of Transport trying to figure out, from a regulatory perspective, if anything needs to change, or if they're happy with the status quo, which is obviously allowing the testing subject to compliance with the code of practice. And finally then, there's the human element, which is that we need to provide information to drivers regarding safe and appropriate use for autonomous vehicles. And the intention behind that is obviously to make sure that the human driver has the skills to work with autonomous vehicles, whether they're a passenger or a driver in those situations. Finally, then, we move on to smart contracts. And Tim's talk touched a little bit on this when he at his last example about a rogue trader attempting to place an illegal trade. This is something that I think potentially smart contracts could reduce the risk of that type of activity happening. So, smart contracts would have their origins in the blockchain. And just as a recap on blockchain, this again is something that's been a hot topic in recent months. Blockchain is the technology behind Bitcoin, which you may be aware is a virtual currency that sort of hit the headlines in a big way when the Silk Road website, which was sort of an underground website for illegal trade, was shut down. So what is blockchain? Well, it's a comprehensive, always up-to-date, distributed record or ledger of who holds what and who transferred what to whom and when. It works through cryptography. And it's quite a sophisticated technology. Blockchain works by authenticating the party's identity and then creating a cryptographic hash of each record. So that means then that each individual part of the blockchain has a specific hash associated with it that identifies it back to that person or that item. It's then distributed, which means that all members or users of the blockchain have access to all of it. It's very different to me holding one piece of information about something and Richard holding something else, and they may be slightly different. So the attraction then is that obviously this means that there is a single version of the truth. So because everybody has access to all of the information, it reduces the possibility of people changing things unilaterally. So a smart contract then is based on the blockchain. We would describe it as software code that represents a self-executing contract as an arrangement that a computer can make, verify, execute, and enforce automatically under specified conditions. If it's possible to do this, and there are some hurdles to it, which I'll come on to in a minute, benefits include lower costs, latency, and error rates. So there is less room for things to go wrong if the process is automated. And I think the comment here is that this is sort of an evolution. It's an evolution of current contracting practices rather than tearing up the rule book and completely rewriting it from scratch. The intention is to take sort of existing laws, put them into a blockchain type AI and use that to facilitate negotiation and signature of contracts in a more streamlined and straightforward way. So, in terms of issues, the first thing to note is that there are some regulatory issues around the adoption of blockchain technology. Secondly, the technology is still quite fragmented. And so here there will need to be some common standards agreed before this sort of gets adopted in the mainstream. Another big issue for blockchain and smart contract technology is actually scalability. Because of the way the blockchain works and because each individual user has a complete copy of it, it actually turns out to be quite energy intensive, meaning that it's very expensive to run because you need significant amounts of processing power. The next issue then is to represent contractual rules as software. So this is sort of for the lawyers in the room. This is sort of like our AI that's chitty of contracts that sets out all of the rules, be they statutory or case law, that regulate how contracts are made and that regulate the interplay between different terms of those contracts, which is it's not an easy ask, that. So although we can break down quite easily the different aspects that are required to be added into the blockchain to create a contract, there's potential for a lot of nuance and options there. And because of that technical requirement to make sure that your AI knows all of the steps that it's required to take to make a valid contract, the relationships between the various parties in the smart contracting environment are very important. So your software developer will need to speak to lawyers to know what rules he needs to put into the algorithm. Your operator will need to know what those rules are and what the choices are and what the impact is. And the same then for a user. So here, I think the initial move to create this in terms of the actual sort of relationships that are put in place to set up smart contracts, they're not necessarily that different to existing IT development, IT services contracts. But the further down in the process you get, you will then need to think about how if you're the provider, how you regulate your liability to the end user or a counterparty to the end user. And then finally, the other thing that we need to bear in mind is that we need to make sure that the smart contract that's set up has the same legal status as current contractual forms. So one of the best examples that I think is there's a lot of talk about how this type of smart contract can be used for transfers of property. And as we know, sort of that the rules on the types of contracts required for that are quite strictly regulated by statute. So if there is a move to smart contracts in that situation, obviously there may need to be a change in the law to reflect that the smart contract is a valid contract. So that's just something else to bear in mind.